Welcome to Eucharistic Miracles from Every Day Can Be a Sunday, a series inspired by St. Carlo Acutis. This is where we dig into the real documented moments when heaven seems to break into the ordinary, the kind of stories that even skeptics have struggled to explain. And Bolsena might be the most painted of them all. Here's what really happened. The hills outside the church don't look like the site of anything extraordinary. Quiet, ordinary. The kind of place travelers pass without a second glance. It's the year 1263. Inside, the air is cool and still, heavy with the smell of melted wax and centuries-old stone. Thin morning light falls across a small altar, built above the bones of a young martyr, St. Christina. A priest is about to celebrate the Eucharist, the part of the Mass where Catholics believe ordinary bread and wine become the actual body and blood of Christ. The only sound is his voice, low and steady, moving through the words he has said 1,000 times before. His name is Peter of Prague. Not a bishop, not a renowned mystic, just a man passing through on his way to Rome, kneeling on cold stone like countless priests before him. But Peter is carrying something with him that no one around him can see, a doubt he has never once said out loud. And in a matter of minutes, that doubt is about to collide with something he never expected. Peter has knelt at altars like this one his entire priesthood. He knows every gesture by heart, the weight of the chalice in his palm, the dry taste of the unleavened bread on his tongue, the particular hush that falls over a room the instant before consecration. But there's one thing he has never told another living soul. For years, somewhere underneath all of it, Peter has quietly struggled to believe that the bread in his hands is anything more than bread, that Christ is truly physically present in what he's holding. It has never fully settled in him. He has built an entire vocation around words he isn't certain he believes, and on this particular morning, he reaches the same point in the liturgy he always does. He lifts the host, he speaks the words. And before he can finish the sentence, he feels it. Warm, wet, spraying across his fingers. Real blood, soaking into the linen beneath his hands. Peter doesn't move. He can't. His first instinct is almost embarrassingly human. He tries to fold the cloth over to hide what's happening. Simply keep going as if nothing has changed. But it has. The thing he spent years quietly unable to believe is now bleeding in his own two hands, in the middle of a sentence he can't take back. Within hours, what this meant would no longer be his to decide alone. Peter does something almost no priest in his position would dare to do. He stops the Mass mid-rite, gathers the stained linen in trembling hands, and asks to be taken immediately to nearby Orvieto, where Pope Urban IV is staying. By the time Peter arrives, dust-covered and shaken, word of what happened has already reached the Pope ahead of him. A claim like this can't simply be taken on faith, not when it strikes the very center of what the Mass is supposed to be. So Pope Urban questions Peter directly, in his own chambers.
Tell me everything.
And at the same time, he sends envoys to Bolsena, working with the local bishop to examine the altar and the church independently. They press the cloth between their fingers. They hold it to the light. There's no trace of dye, no mark that washes away, no simpler explanation anyone can offer. When the investigation is done, the bishop carries the hosts and the blood-marked linen directly into the Pope's own chambers, where Peter is still waiting. Pope Urban doesn't dismiss what he's holding, and he doesn't simply accept it either. He does something far more consequential than either. What he decides to do next would outlast him by 700 years. But to understand what he does next, it helps to know something most people don't. This wasn't the first time anyone had asked for the church for a feast like this. Decades earlier, in the city of Liege, a nun named Juliana, whom the church now honors as Saint Juliana of Liege, had a vision. She saw the church's calendar glow a full moon in the night sky, except for one dark spot. She believed that missing piece of light was a feast the Eucharist still didn't have. In 1246, the local bishop of Liege approved a small celebration of it, but only for his own diocese. Over the next several years, the idea began spreading quietly, well beyond Liege, far enough to reach a man who already knew the place by heart. Pope Urban had once served in that very diocese himself. He'd known the devotion personally for years, long before a priest named Peter ever knelt at an altar in Bolsena. So when the blood-marked linen reaches him, Pope Urban isn't reacting to one miracle alone. He sees a chance to finish something the Church had already begun. He calls for one of the sharpest theological minds in all of Europe, a Dominican friar named Thomas Aquinas, a man so esteemed that the Church would later canonize him as Saint Thomas Aquinas, and may still consider him one of the greatest theological minds Christianity has ever produced. He asks him to write the liturgy for a feast about to stop being scattered and start being universal, Corpus Christi, Latin for the body of Christ. 1 year later, in August of 1264, Pope Urban signs a papal bull, and a feast that had only ever existed in a handful of disconnected corners of Europe suddenly belongs to the entire Church. A miracle in a small Italian town had just helped finish something decades in the making, and the evidence itself never faded into legend. The blood-marked linen still sits inside the Cathedral of Orvieto today, the same cathedral the bishop carried it into all those centuries ago. 2.5 centuries after the miracle, the painter Raphael put the entire scene onto the walls of the Vatican Palace itself, brushed in pigment instead of parchment and ink. Since the 14th century, Orvieto has carried that same relic through its streets for the Feast of Corpus Christi, a tradition that has continued, in one form or another, for nearly 700 years, and still fills the city with candles, incense, and crowds today. That threat to the present has never really faded. In June of 1990, Pope St. John Paul II, canonized by the Church in 2014, walked into that same cathedral on a pastoral visit of his own, standing where the bishop once stood centuries apart. But this is more than a relic and a feast day. It's real blood, still venerated today, and it leaves behind a question that's harder to walk away from than the history itself. What does the Church really mean when it says that the bread becomes the body of Christ? It's not a small question, and it's not a comfortable one to sit with. Peter quietly carried that doubt for years, until one impossible morning finally answered it for him. Not everyone gets a moment like that, but the question doesn't disappear just because we haven't seen it ourselves, and Bolsena isn't the only time heaven has answered it. What happened in Bolsena was investigated and confirmed by a pope. It didn't rest on one priest's word alone, and it still doesn't. There's an actual answer to Peter's question, a specific word the Church has used for centuries. And once you know what it means, you may never hear those 4 words at Mass, "This is my body," quite the same way again. Here's what the word is. Transubstantiation. It's the Church's term for something stranger than it sounds. At the moment of consecration, the bread and wine don't simply represent the body and blood of Christ. In substance, they become it, even though everything you can see, taste, and measure about them stays exactly the same. It doesn't ask you to see anything different. It asks you to believe that something invisible has genuinely changed underneath what your senses could ever detect. That's exactly what Peter of Prague struggled with for most of his priesthood, until, for reasons no one has ever fully explained, the invisible became visible in his own 2 hands. In our next video, we're going deeper into how the Church actually explains this, borrowing ideas about substance and appearance from ancient Greek philosophy, which St. Thomas Aquinas applied directly to the bread and wine. So make sure you're subscribed and tap that notification bell, because the next time you hear a priest say those words, "This is my body," you may find yourself looking at the altar a little differently than you ever have before.